Good evening. It's Wednesday. It's 7:30. That means only one thing. It's time for the Shakespeare Hour Live. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be back. And before I say anything else, thank you for your incredible support of our virtual gala, Shakespeare Everywhere. I know how many of you tuned in. Thank you for your wonderful messages. Thank you for your incredible support. I'm pleased to say that over 10,000 people across the globe have now seen the gala, and we exceeded our financial goal, and it was a huge success, and that is down to all of you. So thank you very, very much. It's wonderful to be back with you. My thanks to Leonie Noble for so brilliantly co-hosting with Drew last week. And before we get on to tonight's discussion, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Tonight's episode has been generously supported by James and Cynthia Tuitt. James and Cynthia, thank you so very much. The Shakespeare Hour is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is in turn sponsored by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Thank you. Well, before I came to Washington to take over the Shakespeare Theatre Company, I was fortunate enough to direct a production in Japan. It was a production of Hamlet in Japanese that I directed in Tokyo, without, I'm afraid to say, managing to speak myself a word of Japanese. But the experience was extraordinary and deeply formative, and something that I've thought again and again about. And so we thought it would be wonderful this evening to spend an hour talking about Shakespeare and Japan. It's a huge topic, but I'm excited about beginning a dialogue about what and who Shakespeare is in Japan and what we can all learn from each other. So this evening, I am joined by a wonderful panel. Let me introduce them to you. First of all, I'd like to introduce Ako Dachs, Lucile Lortel Award nominated actress and founding artistic director of Amaterasu, a Japanese-English bilingual theatre company. Ako, are you there?
Hi, hello. Hi, my name is Ako. I am so happy to be here. And also same time, I'm so honored Simon called me and just introducing myself, everything.
Well, exactly, Ako. Well, the honor and the pleasure is all of ours. Thank you for making time to join us tonight and our audience. I'm going to ask you an icebreaking question. I'm going to put you on the spot, Ako, this evening and say, wondering where you might be tuning in, where you're broadcasting from tonight, but also if you had to choose an imaginary Shakespeare landscape, a setting of one of Shakespeare's plays that summed you up inside, where are you poetically this evening? Where are you actually? And which Shakespeare location are you going to choose to sum up your inner world? Yes, let me ask you. Ako, back to you.
Scotland.
Scotland. Because
when I found out about you, I wanted to see, who you are. So I Googled and I found Dr. Kawai, and he translated also many, plays in Shakespeare. So I downloaded his plays, and also just a couple of months ago, I did Zoom reading with my theater company in Japanese Scottish play. So it's a little bit hard, I couldn't find the rhythm, and but when I read Dr. Kawai's script, it was amazing. It's like when I study Shakespeare, it's like he break out midline ending, split lines. Literally, visually. So
Great.
Yeah. Oh my.
Great. Well, that's a big plug for our next guest, which is terrific, Ako. Thank you, and terrific that the world of the Scottish play of Macbeth is still circulating around you, and you feel even that you're a little bit like you're in Shakespeare's Scotland this evening, which is terrific. And so, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Sho Kawai, Professor of English Literature and Shakespeare at the University of Tokyo, and indeed the President of the Shakespeare Society of Japan. Sho, good evening and welcome. And I think you're joining us from Tokyo, is that right?
Yes. Good morning from Tokyo. It's just 8 o'clock in the morning. It's so nice to be here.
Wow. Well, thank you for getting up so early to join us in your early morning, and it's very nice to see you show to the viewers translated the production of Hamlet that I directed.
Yes.
He's responsible for translating it into English, into Japanese. So it's really a special pleasure for me to be reunited with Sho tonight. Sho, tell us, you're in Tokyo, but what's the Shakespearean landscape that you're really inside your heart?
Yes, I feel as if I'm on the top of the Elsinore Castle, surrounded by the mist, waiting for something to happen. I'm so excited.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. Surrounded by ghosts and drama. Thank you so much, Sho. Terrific. And let me now move on to introduce Dr. Natsu Onoda Power, Helen Hayes Award-winning playwright, director, and associate professor of performance studies here at Georgetown University, here meaning, of course, DC. Welcome, Dr. Natsu. Are you there?
I'm here. Thank you so much. Honored to be here. Actually, professor now. I just got a promotion this year.
Well, I mean, congratulations. I mean, that's...
Well, thank you so much.
The panel becomes ever more illustrious, even by the minute. So that's wonderful. And let me ask you where you are of Shakespeare's plays, which setting sums you up inside them?
I have to say I'm in the forest, the Midnight Summer Dream, and more precisely I'm like in the play within the play, the Traveling Players play. I'm currently in my home virtual theater studio. You can see my camera set up in the background. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I've kind of gathered like homemade material to create little theater pieces, having a lot of fun with it, but making do with what I have.
Wow. Well, I think, Professor Natsu, I need to award you the prize for the most interesting backdrop we've ever had on the Shakespeare Hour. I mean, it's full of interest. I feel very jealous of having such an exciting studio to make theatre live in during a time when most theatres are, of course, so sadly closed. So it looks like a really inspiring backdrop. And thank you for joining us this evening. Let me now introduce finally my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew, not yet Professor, Drew Lichtenberg, but I'm sure you live in hope, Drew. It's Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC, resident dramaturg and literary manager. Good evening, Drew.
Hello, Simon. I am an adjunct professor as well. So just so you know, FYI.
Well, thank you.
And I'm broadcasting as usual from my basement here in Petworth in Washington, D.C. So I'm feeling like Timon in my cave, ranting and railing about man's inhumanity to man, but not to be heavy or anything. I'm very excited for tonight's panel. Before we get started discussing Shakespeare in Japan, I also want to personally thank Dr. James Ulak. Jim served for 25 years as the senior curator of Japanese art at the Freer Sackler Gallery. He was one of the first people that we talked to when we started developing this episode, Grace Ann and I, and Jim's contributions were really extremely valuable. And we just want to thank him at the start of the show as we started to explore this connection between Shakespeare and Japan. And we've already received a ton of questions from our audience members that are really exciting. Before we get to our Q&A, we want to start with our guiding introductory question of the night and hear from each of our panelists. As Simon was saying, the subject is a very big one. We're talking about not only the reception of Shakespeare in Japanese culture and in Japanese theater, but also the history of Japanese theatrical forms and how they intersected with, or continue to intersect with Shakespeare. Like Simon, I have also been to Tokyo only for half a week on my honeymoon. We saw a kabuki performance, which is a living theatrical form that goes all the way back to the 1600s. So it stretches back all the way to Shakespeare's time. No drama is also still performed and stretches back even further, as well as bunraku. So there's no way we're going to cover every aspect of the subject tonight. Consider this our humble introduction. Our question is, what is the understanding of Shakespeare and his works in Japan? And our panelists can interpret that however they want. What is the history of it? What is it now? What is it to them personally? Dr. Sho, I wonder if we could start with you as the president of the Shakespeare Society in Japan, indeed.
Yes, sir. Hi. I will tell you how Shakespeare was received for the first time in Japan. It was the production of Merchant of Venice in 1885 in Kabuki style. When Shakespeare was first received, it was received as a Kabuki because in Japan there was the form only a Kabuki as a theater, excepting for a Kyogen and No. So firstly, it was always received as kabuki. And I'd like to mention my gratitude to Akko for her comments on my translations. Well, there are many translations so far, and I had tried to analyze the lisms and rhymes of Shakespeare's text into Japanese. So now it's quite different from what it was received as kabuki, but now I think I'm trying to receive Shakespeare as it is and expressing it in Japanese. So I'd like to ask Simon for his appreciation of Japanese translation, my Japanese translation, how he find my Japanese translation different from English. Well, yes.
Well, great. Sure, thank you. That's terrific to so quickly put me on the spot. Well, I think that okay. So in a moment, Sho, I'm going to hand back to you because I think it would be wonderful for you also to just to touch on the iambic pentameter in Japanese, because we know, of course, in Shakespeare in English, Shakespeare writes in a particular didum, 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 didum rhythm. That's the sort of heartbeat of Shakespeare. Now, and actually, I can just see a question coming in from Drew, which I might be able to fold into my reply. This is already a very, very lively discussion. Drew, do you want to come in with something on that?
Well, we actually have a question from our viewer, James, who is asking precisely this about the rhythm of Shakespeare's language, the iambic pentameter of which you speak, or the blank verse, and how that translates into Japanese as a language. So I just want to give a shout out to viewer James.
Thank you, James. That's excellent. So essentially what I was conscious of, Sho, which is really, of course, through the lens of the actors that I was working with, which is similar to, I think, what Akko was saying, was I found that the actors' excitement that you had created a kind of speakable version of the play, a version of the play that was not formal, that was not entombed in a kind of tradition, that was not awkward or stiff to speak, but was very energizing. And I think my work, as our viewers will know, hopefully, in the realm of English-speaking Shakespeare, is to find an ease with the language, to find a relaxation, to find a naturalness with the language. And my senses show that you had preserved some of the technical structures of the language whilst creating a very actable account of Hamlet for, as it were, a generation that was younger, perhaps, than some of the generations, much like in England or America, who in a way have associated Shakespeare with formality and a certain straight literariness. This was a Shakespeare very much brought to life. But let me hand it back to Sho, if I may, just to see whether you feel that was your aim, and to talk to James's question about how the iambic pentameter and the rhythm works in Japanese. Sho.
Thank you. Yes. So nowadays, people, I think, are approaching Shakespeare as if they are Shakespeare is our own. It's the treasure in Japanese culture as well. It's not something that is imported from abroad, but now it is our own, and that is because of the many history of translation has recreated Shakespeare's lisms and well, actually, the rhymes has been abandoned so far, and I think I am the first, perhaps, translator who tried to focus on the rhymes as well. So I think, yes, Simon, you are. I think I'm very happy to hear that that Shakespeare is now, I think, appreciated in Japan as well as in abroad as much as in Britain as well. Likewise.
And Sho, can you just talk a little bit about the rhythm of a line in Japanese? Maybe if we only took a line of English and then you did a live translation of us. Does the iambic pentameter in a Japanese translation of Shakespeare, does it still work? or is the rhythm?
That's a very, very good question, because Japanese structure is very different from English. We have every vowel and every, we have to use the vowel in trying to speak our Japanese sentence. Like, so for instance, this is what I would like, I intended to mention in the text section, but like to be or not to be. In order to interpret this, we have to use many syllables. Like in my translation, it will be ikiru beki ka, shinu beki ka, and that would take many syllables to express the same thing. So we have to kind of speed up our sentence when we're trying to catch up to the English version. But so that's the problem. So we have to try to express the meaning using as few consonants as possible. And that's the trouble with the translator. So it is very hard to express the iambic pentameter in Japanese, but we are trying to kind of assimilate it.
I think this conversation has become very technical very quickly. And luckily we have Ako, an actress who heads a bilingual theater company in Japanese and English. So you, I think, are ideally suited to discuss these questions of translation between different cultures and also different languages. Ako, how do you come to this question of the reception of Shakespeare in Japanese? I think it's so fascinating what Sho said about it originally being performed in kabuki style, yes, and it now being assimilated and not imported, but rather a kind of native form that the Japanese feel are their own. And also this question of translating the lines backward and forward and trying to replicate the pentameter.
Yes. When I was in Japan, it was not so many, and of course not, Dr. Kawai's translation was not out yet. So I saw many Shakespeare productions, like they called Shingeki versus to Kabuki, old style. It's more naturalistic style of acting companies. They played many Shakespeares. So I saw them. And also later, Mr. Yukio Ninagawa, the director, he started to direct with the huge, big theater companies, producing companies. So more elaborate and almost like a pageant to me. And so to me, Shakespeare is just one of foreign plays, foreign countries' plays. Then I came to United States, and then I saw Derek Jacobi's Much Ado, RSC touring company. And it was mesmerizing. And I thought, oh my God, this is the Shakespeare. Is with the clarity and the rhythm and the fun. That one I didn't get when I was in Japan. So the thing is translation. Really, it's key is the translation. How like Dr. Kawai's, how to keep rhythm and iambic and the rhyming, how they can keep it in Japanese. And when I did Julius Caesar in OSF, Oregon Shakespeare Company, like 10 years ago almost, I played soothsayer Artemidorus and Caius Ligarius. And the director, Amanda Dennett, asked me to do Caesar's nightmare scene in Japanese. And at the time I tried to to see many translations. And I finally found very, very old, like Meiji era, I think it's 19th century, Shoyo Tsubouchi translated Julius Caesar. And that was perfect. He has a rhythm, and it's like an old Japanese poetry, Japanese verses. And so that I used it, and that was amazing. So that is my comparing.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Akko. Thank you so much. And Shoyo, I'm glad you mentioned him because he was, I believe, he completed the first complete works of Shakespeare in Japanese translation. So sort of like Schlegel and Tieck are the Germans who finished the complete Shakespeare, and in Japan, it's Shoyo. Natsu, I want to include you in this conversation, although we're going to come back to Sho, I'm sure, for maybe a correction on my gloss of Shoyo. But you have a very unique relationship, I think, to both Japanese and American theater. And I wonder, because you have a different perspective as somebody who's a playwright, a director, a creator of new works in America, how you respond to this question of Japanese and Eastern theatrical cultures versus Shakespeare and Western ones.
So I feel like I have encountered Shakespeare's works 3 different times in my life, in three different phases. The first was when I was growing up in Japan, maybe at the age of 6 to 12 or so. I read them in the form of graphic novels, Shakespeare's works adapted into graphic novel or manga. And, you know, of course, at that age, I didn't know who Shakespeare was. I just read them as wonderful stories with vivid characters that I vaguely knew were plays adapted into graphic novels, but I was really infatuated with them. And you know, time went and I started college and I read them again in English, in the original language. And then I discovered this new layer of the language. You know, I encountered the stories through visual storytelling, and now I was understanding them with the sound of the original language through classic productions that I was seeing, even the college productions my friends were putting on. So I just didn't know that there was like anything more that can be done to this amazing stories. And then there was. And then the third time was when I was actually starting to work as a designer. The very first professional set design gig that I had was for Chicago Shakespeare Company for the production of Romeo and Juliet for a touring show. It was like a short Shakespeare series. It was like an hour version of Romeo and Juliet. And now I was discovering it again through the visual world. And when you design a show, you just get to know the show so much better. And yeah, so I feel like these 3 instances of encounters have really transformed the way I perceive the work.
Yeah, thank you. I love the fact that you encountered Shakespeare in manga form first, because I actually experienced Shakespeare when I was a little kid in a comic book of Midsummer Night's Dream that I had when I was a child. And I think there's something very universal about the way Shakespeare is translated into other media as well. Shoi, you had a point you wanted to make about translation.
Yes, now that you mentioned Shoyo Tsubouchi as the first translator of Shakespeare's works in Japan, I would like to mention that he's my relative. He's kind of a grand uncle. Shoyo Tsubouchi has an elder brother, and his elder brother's grandson's grandson is me. So I'm related. And also, the Akko mentioned Ninagawa-san, Yukio Ninagawa is the great director. He's now, sorry, he's now gone. But I clearly remember that our triumph of at the Stratford-upon-Avon, Ninagawa brought his Titus Andronicus in 2006, and starring Kotaro Yoshida as the Titus. And it was magnificent. It was reviewed so well. And that was the point in 2006 that I felt from my deep heart that we have reached the level of the Shakespeare production quite as much as the British productions. I mean, when I was a student, I felt as if we were kind of trying to follow the footsteps of European productions. But at 2006, with the Titus Andronicus by Ninagawa-san, I think we have in quite in the breast with your production. So now I feel quite certain that we are in this kind of together. I'm feeling togetherness all around towards Shakespeare, and we're not kind of borrowing Shakespeare from European culture. That's what I would like to say.
I want to get to some questions from our audience members because there's a bunch of them, and I think there's a lot of curiosity about this topic, which is great. We have a question from Linda asking what percentage of the Japanese theater society does Shakespeare consist of? Like, how common are Shakespeare's plays as part of the Japanese repertory? And along a similar line, question from Charlotte Von Rains, what are the most popular of Shakespeare's plays in Japan? Is there a play? I know that the Germans love Hamlet, for instance. Maybe being indecisive in the middle of nowhere, being subject to history appeals to them. But what are the plays that really resonate in Japan? And maybe Simon, you might have insight on this, having directed over there. But Sho and Akko, I'm curious for your thoughts. Yes.
May I? So it's a very good question. I haven't got a very exact statistics, but I think it's quite common in Japanese Japanese theater history that and also at current moment Shakespeare is quite popular. At the moment, we have now reached this production of Richard II running at the New National Theatre, and it was very good production. And also we have now finished yesterday the production of Midsummer Night's Dream by Benjamin Britten. It's an opera. And so every day you can watch some kind of Shakespeare productions in Tokyo. You cannot miss it. So it's that popular. And also for the popular plays, I think Hamlet is the best, most popular, and also A Midsummer Night's Dream. What do you think, Simon? You're muted.
Sorry, of course, one has to have a moment of being muted in every show, and that was mine. I was certainly conscious that Hamlet was extremely popular, the play that I directed, and I felt a great enthusiasm from the Tokyo audiences for that title. I think that it was interesting as I reflect on Hamlet, discovering though that when I was rehearsing it, it felt like the play was perceived as being more a tragedy and a play of darkness than a play of also of lightness. So I remember working a lot with the extraordinary actor that played Hamlet, encouraging him to be crazy and provocative and rebellious and all the things that Hamlet is, as well as simply melancholy. And that Polonius, as well as the schemer, was also somebody who was very funny. And I suppose what Akko was saying about the freedom and playfulness that Shakespeare also has is work, I think, for us all right now, to remember that he's always the opposite of what you think he is, in a way. But I also want to kind of hear Akko on that, but I also want to speak to Natsu's question of growing up with these manga versions of Shakespeare, because I'm curious, I suppose, about what it is. Is there such a thing as a different Shakespeare in Japan? Does Shakespeare speak to something particular in the Japanese sensibility, if we can even say there is such a thing, in a way that maybe he represents something different in America or different in England? I mean, maybe it's the depth of the archetypes. I don't know, but I wonder whether, Natsu, you have a feeling of that, and then I could ask the same question to Akko before we get back to Drew for the audience. Natsu.
Not sure. I think well, I don't know what the how Shakespeare appeals to Japanese sensibilities, but the stories, the adaptations that particularly appealed to me and my friends at that age were the ones that take Shakespeare and kind of do meta adaptations of them. For instance, there was an episode in the Astro Boy series that called Romeo and Juliet. It was a love story between two robots, but based on Romeo and Juliet. And there was also a series about a professional understudy who's also a thief. He understudies for people as profession, and he goes and steals from audience members. And there was an episode of Hamlet where he was playing the part of Hamlet to the audience, and in the audience was his actual father, who is estranged from. So it was a triple meta commentary on the plot. And I don't know, these were the ones that appealed to me. And I think that the father-son relationship in that particular story was, and the importance of decorum. And I think that was particularly appealing to us growing up.
Drew.
I mean, one thing that there are so many directions to go in. I do think as you mentioned, Sho, the discovery of Shakespeare happens relatively late in Japan, right? The first production is The Merchant of Venice in the 1880s. And I think before the restoration of the Meiji Emperor, you have the shogunate that seals Japan off to the West entirely for 250 years, right? Or centuries. So it feels like Shakespeare is synonymous with modernity, or the discovery of this other world out there, and that he's coming as part of this Victorian era. Victorian is a Western, historicization, but that he lends himself to manga very easily because he's part of this experience of the modern world. He doesn't have the baggage for maybe Japanese people that Shakespeare has in other parts of the world. We have had a number of questions about Kurosawa and his film adaptations of Shakespeare, Throne of Blood probably being the most famous, but also Ron, his King Lear, his adaptation of Hamlet, and how Kurosawa, the great Japanese filmmaker, turns to Shakespeare and actually sets him in feudal Japan and uses elements from Noh theater, especially for Throne of Blood with the woman spinning the circle like a chorus member. So what is the opinion of Kurosawa's films and his adaptations of Shakespeare in Japan? Have they almost supplanted Shakespeare as the definitive versions for many Japanese people?
Wow.
Ako.
Yes, because I played that Lady Asaji of Throne of Blood. Actually, Ping-chan adapted back from Kurosawa's movie to the theater. And I did at OSF, or Shakespeare. I played Lady M, and all other casts are multiracial. That time, OSF company members were totally, mixed. Macbeth played by African-American actor, and Banquo played by white Americans. And, it's so many, and people in the theater played samurai, feudal Japan samurai. And it was so fun, one more thing is I would like to say is, because of his production, Shakespeare production, often in Japan and translated into Old Japan. It's like Edo period or feudal time in Japan as well. So, and the costume-wise, and the scenery is also, it's strikingly beautiful. And it's matching that Shakespeare's heightened language with that costume and makeup is so the Japanese people really loved it to watch that.
I think this speaks to Natsu's point about the three ways she experienced Shakespeare. There's the story with the comic books, the language when she's studying him in college, and then the visual world as a designer. And I think when you produce Shakespeare, you have to tackle those three worlds in every production you do. And it sounds like maybe Kurosawa setting his adaptations in feudal Japan, he produces a sense of that heightened language through the spectacular visuals of his films. And I was watching, Akko, the video of the Ping Chong that you sent us. And what's fascinating is that Ping Chong stages it as a kind of no drama. It seems very similar. It doesn't have the bridge, but it has similar like physicality and similar dimensions to the no theater stage, which is a very recognizable stylized form. Sho, were you going to say something? Yes.
Yes, I would like to mention that the Throne of Blood adaptation of Macbeth was produced in 1957, just after the World War II, and the Run adaptation of King Lear is 1985. And I would argue that those are the period in which we Japanese are trying to assimilate Shakespeare into the Japanese culture. And that's where we're trying to kind of chasing Shakespeare and putting him into Japanese culture. And now I think we have now very satisfied with what we have done. And also, I think it's the Throne of Blood is a very good representation of Macbeth in a samurai film, and also it's as you mentioned, it's using the no style. And so we are kind of mingling the Japanese culture with Shakespeare, and Kurosawa succeeded in it. And I also like to mention that we are very happy with these assimilations and making Shakespeare as our own, because Shakespeare is a classic. We all knew the stories, but although we are referring to Shakespeare, we are not actually discussing all the 40 plays of Shakespeare. Nobody mentions Two Gentlemen of Verona or Love's Labour's Lost. All the Japanese people know Romeo, Romeo, forfort art Romeo, or to be or not to be. That's the famous lines, and Japanese know it. But nobody knows lines from Love's Labour's Lost or Two Gentlemen of Verona. So I think that the situation is the same worldwide, but Shakespeare is a very good icon because we are kind of sharing it as a common treasure, and that's what happens in Japanese culture as well.
Hearing you speak about 1957 and that period of World War II assimilation makes me think of the films of Ozu, who was a great contemporary of Kurosawa's. And his Tokyo Story, people are still dressed like almost in feudal costumes, traditional Japanese clothing, but you have a Coca-Cola advertisement in the film, which seems to be similar to Shakespeare. It's the West coming in and being assimilated. Simon, we have been talking for so long. We are at our interval. Do you want to share anything with our viewers about upcoming episodes before we get to some text in Japanese and also in English?
Yes, I'd love to, Drew. Thank you. Well, so look, we're going to continue our global theme next week when we go ahead to England to discuss where Shakespeare sits in Great Britain today. And I'm going to be joined by the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Greg Doran, a former employer of mine, who gave me my first job at the Royal Shakespeare Company. So I'm delighted to be reunited with Greg next week, and also with Farah Karim Cooper, who is the head of higher education at the Globe Theatre in London. So we're going to have two illustrious Shakespeareans, and we're also waiting for news of a third guest, which we'll be able to email you as soon as we've had that confirmed. But definitely Greg and Farah, excuse me. So yeah, that's next week. Now, what's going to happen in order to help Farah and Greg is we're going to record that on English time, which means that it's going to be a pre-recorded show next week. I'm so sorry, it's not completely live, but we would love you to send your questions for Greg, for me, for Farah about Shakespeare in Great Britain today ahead of time. So Grace Ann's going to talk you through that by email, and I'm sure Drew will also have something to say on that. So yeah, please send your questions in by next Tuesday for next Wednesday's episode, Shakespeare and Great Britain. Back to you, Drew.
Thank you, Simon. So as I said, we've asked some of our guests to prepare some passages of text illustrate these complex questions of translation from Japanese to English and back again. And we actually, indeed, in the first half of the show, we heard some from Sho. I wonder, Akko, you were mentioning the Scottish play. Do you have a passage from the Scottish play that might be illustrative for us?
Yes, I could read Dr. Kawai's translation of Macbeth, and I could do the letter scene after she read the letter. So can I go on? Shall I? Yes? Okay. あなたはグラン、そして今やコーダーの領主、それから約束されたものにおなりでしょう。でも気がかりはあなたのご気性。人情というお乳にあふれすぎて近道なんかできやしない。偉くなりたいのに、野心がないわけではないのに、手は汚したくない。すごく欲しいのに、清く正しくやろうとする。不正はしたくない。でも間違っても勝ち取りたい。あなたの欲しいものは、欲しいならこうしなければならぬ。と叫んでいる。それをやるのがあなたは怖いだけ。やらなければよかったと思うわけではない。いらっしゃい、ここへ。あなたの耳に注いであげる。私の心意気を追い払ってあげる。この下の勇気で、あなたの黄金の冠の邪魔になるものを。運命も、この世ならぬものも、あなたの頭上にそれを乗せようとしているのだから。
Wow, I know that speech so well that I'm transliterating in my mind, Akko, Glams thou art, Cawdor thou shalt be. And it's fascinating how the emotion seems to match very closely on a line level or on a stress level even.
Because Dr. Kawai did it, and he actually literally, split the line, mid-line ending, and also with some other characters, he just intended to covering iambic, filling up remaining iambic line with another character. He really did it, change the how I can say, move back to just right after who can come in to fill the line. So that is really, I think it's now in Japan, it's actors having such a great time and easy time than we had it before.
We have a question from Anonymous. If King Lear is 3.5 hours in English, is it the same length in Japanese translation? Or is it much longer given what was said in the first half of the show regarding vowels and consonant sounds?
Dr. Kawai.
Dr. Kawai.
Yes, when we translate Shakespeare into Japanese, it takes much longer, much longer. So that's why the actors have to speak very fast in order to make it as long as Shakespeare original. That's our problem. That's our problem with the Japanese language.
But also, I remember, when we were doing Hamlet, we had to cut the play a lot.
Yes.
This was also, which actually I'm not averse to doing. So I was happy, and I was particularly good when we realized we had to do it, otherwise it was going to be a very, very, very long evening. So that was a good discipline, I think.
Speaking of Hamlet, I believe, do we have video queued up?
Yeah. We're going to show a little bit. Now, look, some of you might have seen this footage because we showed it as part of our gala of some of the actors from the Hamlet that I directed and show's translation being reunited and doing some of the extracts from Hamlet. And I think what people have written to me actually who saw this footage was a real recognition that even though they couldn't speak Japanese, these were actors that were able to deliver the language in a very truthful way. And I think that's a tribute to the translation, and it's a tribute to what we're talking about this evening, which is about Japan taking Shakespeare as its own, and not anymore as a literary form, as it were, but as a very speakable, actable, living form. And I feel like they embody that terrifically. But see for yourself, everyone. Here we go. Let's ask Gordon to see whether we can bring this up.
文化村シアターコクーンの加藤です。私たちは2019年にサイモンさん演出のハムレットを上演いたしました。ナショナルシアターで初めて彼にお会いした時の印象は、とにかく明るくてフレンドリーで、ユーモアとエネルギーに満ち溢れていました。稽古中もその印象通り、日本の俳優たちと素晴らしい共同作業により、400年前の登場人物ではなく、現代を生きる人々の物語のように、テンポよく世代や文化を超えて楽しめる作品になりました。今回日本の俳優たちも思い思いにお気に入りのセリフを映像でお届けいたしました。
生きるべきか死ぬべきか、それが問題だ。どちらが気高い心にふさわしいのか、非道な運命の矢玉をじっと耐え忍ぶか、それとも怒涛の苦難に切りかかり戦って相果てるか。死ぬことは眠ること、それだけだ。
そして私は誰よりも惨めで哀れな女。あの方の蜜のように甘い恋の調べに酔ったのに、今聞こえてくるのは気高く惜しいお心がひび割れた鐘となって出す狂った音色。みずみずしく類いまれな花のお姿も狂気の毒で枯れ果てた。あ、悲しい。昔の思いを胸に秘めつつ、今の思いに胸つぶれるとは。
何より肝心なのは、己に嘘をつくなということだ。これさえ守れば夜は昼に続くように自然と誰かを裏切るようなことにはならない。さらばだ。わしの言葉がお前の中で実を結ぶように。
この病んだ心は罪人の証。些細なことが大きな災いの前触れに思える。罪の心には愚かな不安がみなぎりあふれ、こぼすまいと思えばかえってこぼしてしまう。
Well, thank you very much, actors from the Cocoon Company there. Drew.
Question from Barbara Harmon for you, Simon. How did you direct a play in a language that you couldn't speak?
Well, Barbara, it's a terrific question. Thank you. And actually, when I was listening to Akko just do the very powerful passage from Macbeth, it really reminded me of being in the rehearsal room. And basically, what happened was that the team in Tokyo had prepared a script with 3 columns. The English, the Japanese, and the phonetic Japanese, so that essentially I could listen and try and follow, even if I couldn't obviously follow the Japanese, but I could follow the phonetics a little bit. But the main thing, which what helped me most, which what Drew just was describing, was the fact that I knew Hamlet extremely well, having played Hamlet at school when I was 17, having directed it at university, and then having directed it once again for the Royal Shakespeare Company, in fact, twice for the Royal Shakespeare Company, once in Stratford and then again on tour, which of course came to Washington, i.e. I was able to listen and essentially just do those little things like glams in the Macbeth speech, but with Hamlet, look for little words for which I could place myself where the actors were, and essentially try and follow the emotional rhythms and intentions and attitudes of the actors in front of me. And very early on, I had a wonderful assistant director, a Japanese assistant director, that said to me, Simon, can you tell when the actors are acting and when they are just being themselves through Shakespeare? And I said to him, I can't really tell, I'm afraid. No, I can't really tell the difference between the acting and the life. But then gradually I tried to tune in, and I did notice the difference of when formal acting appeared. And I went back to the assistants, and I think Shoei probably spoke about this too, and I said, do Japanese audiences want the big formal style? Or do they want something simple and more truthful? Because I didn't know what audiences for this theatre in this moment in time were actually looking for. And the assistant director said to me, I think they want simple and true. They want the actors to sound like they're doing the tea break with the language. So from that moment on, I realized that my quest of directing in Tokyo was the same as it is in London or in Washington or anywhere else. Essentially, be the truth monitor. Can you be the thermometer which tells you whether something is essentially real or essentially fake? And that was an enormous help to me. And then actually realized that truth is much more holistic than just being able to understand what someone's saying. Truth is something that you feel. We have that expression, don't we? The ring of truth. Does it ring true, we say? And I think this expression conjures up something about the intuitive relationship human beings have to something that is real or phony. So in that respect, it was not straightforward, but it was a way through. And of course, the fact that Sho was so committed himself to being the next generation of translator and wanting the language to be supple and speakable in a way that Akos described as well and embodied this feeling also really helped me. Sho, is that a good memory of the process, or did you feel there was something very different?
Well, exactly as you said. Well, I felt the same way. Yes, I quite agree with you.
It's so interesting to me how questions of style keep on coming up. Sorry to interrupt, Sho, but it seems like each period has its own form that feels true to that respective era, but feels from the vantage point of the present moment like artifice. Natsu, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm wondering how you as a director, a playwright, a designer come to this question of truth and artifice in the theater. Do you, when you are creating works, search for a certain type of truth or a style, or how do you develop that kind of artistic language?
Well, Drew, you asked a question that I've been asking all my life, right? Like, if I solve that problem, then I'll just retire. But it's so easy for us to worry about stuff, and worry about, what is it supposed to be? And the exercise that I sometimes do for myself and for, I make all my students do, is to come up with as many sentences as possible that goes like this. This is a story of A who B. Like for instance, with Hamlet, this is a story of a son who loses his father, or this is a story of a son who grows to hate his mother, or like just come up with like as many sentences like that as possible, and just remain true to these sentences as possible throughout the process. And that's how I keep myself grounded, and also I encourage my students to be grounded. So instead of worrying about stuff, you just like
actually,
the heart.
And thank you, Natsu, because it's interesting that when I went to Tokyo, the producers said to me, please don't try and do a production of Hamlet set in Japan. Please, don't try and think it's clever to do either the feudal version or Japanese sushi bars. Or you don't know anything about that. Stick to what you know, which I think in a way, Natsu, you're saying, which is your ground is your experiences, your integrity, your authenticity of association, rather than stepping outside of that, which is always going to be another kind of fakery, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
It can happen to take place in a visual world that evoke different environments and different times, but the story has to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, Aristotle says something very similar about complex versus simple structures of plot. He says the most beautiful kind of plot is complex, and it's one in which you can hold all of the elements of the story in your mind without forgetting one. That it is long enough to be complicated, but without any extraneous elements. And it seems like that exercise you do with your students, Natsu, is about distilling the story in a beautiful way so that it makes sense and resonates in an authentic way.
And not even the central part of the story either. You know what I mean? It could be like a little part of the story that has its own sentence.
We're coming close to time, but I want to get some questions in before the end because I don't think I will be able to answer them in the Friday mailbag. One is about Kenneth Branagh's film adaptation of As You Like It, which was set in the Meiji era of Japan. John and Nancy Gardner wondering, how was this received in Japan? Was it received as a kind of exoticizing portrait or a nostalgic portrait or what have you? Sure.
I believe that film was not released in Japan, so it was not received anyway. And I felt myself when I saw it, it was based on Japonism. I think kind of actually doesn't know anything about Japanese culture so much. I think that's the image of Japanese culture, and in that way we can appreciate that. It's well, in history, back in history, Royal Shakespeare Company produced Titus Andronicus in Japanese setting, and they were using chopsticks in samurai mode, and that worked so fine. And so it's a level of appreciation of Japanese culture. There are variations, and we can enjoy them.
A couple more questions. One from Glenn about the class structure in Shakespeare's plays. And do you replicate that for the very distinctive Japanese class structure when you produce a play in Japan or translate it? And a similar question about Shakespeare's body. How do you translate, Anonymous wants to know, probably because they're perhaps, I don't know, afraid of being exposed. How do you translate Shakespeare's dirty innuendos and double entendres in Japanese? Do you get as smutty as the bard gets? Or do you clean him up as often we do in performance? Sure.
Well, as a translator, I think it is our duty to put Shakespeare in Japanese culture. So when the English-speaking audience appreciates something, then we Japanese should appreciate the same thing in the same way. So that's, I think, my job. So we're not kind of moderating or anything. If we kind of moderating or changing it, it will be adaptation. That's my belief. And also about the classes, we are not transplanting Shakespeare into Japanese culture. We are translating it. And so that means that we are not using the Japanese structure or Japanese culture. We're not bringing those things into Shakespeare. We're trying to understand Shakespeare in this 21st modern Japanese way. So now we are not fixing Shakespeare in any way. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very interesting how reflective contemporary attitudes towards Shakespeare are, where it's like we don't have to reset him in Japanese culture or edit him or clean him up. He can simply be what he is now to us because he's a part of our culture and we understand Shakespeare. Is that right? Akko, you're nodding your head in agreement. Well, this has been an hour on the Shakespeare Hour Live. It's sort of flown by. I know I have learned a lot about the fascinating depth of the relationship between Shakespeare and Japan. I think we've in no way comprehensively answered the question, but we have definitely scratched the surface. I want to thank all of our panelists for being such brilliant guests. As Simon said, the theme next week is Shakespeare and Britain today, continuing our travel around the world. And we'll be joined by Gregory Duran of the Royal Shakespeare Company and Dr. Farah Kareem Cooper of Shakespeare's Globe. As Simon was saying, we're recording on UK time, so please submit your questions to us ahead of time so that we can answer as many as possible to Greg, Simon, and Farah. The link, you can ask those questions in the chat here, and the link will also be included in Friday's newsletter. So that will be coming to you soon, and we'll try to include as many as possible as we can. So thank you all so much. I'm signing off. Simon?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you to my wonderful panel, to Akko, to Natsu, to Sho. It's Joe. I feel nostalgic about Tokyo. It's wonderful that you've been able to join us live from that extraordinary city. I can't wait to come back and carry on, if I may, creating work with you, and look forward, Akko and Natsu, to also finding ways of collaborating, I hope, in the months and years to come. My thanks to you all. This is me. It's good night from Simon Godwin, and good night from a wonderful panel. Good night.